Welcome to Criminal Law class. This class is on unlawful act manslaughter. Here I'm going to examine one of the most significant forms of involuntary manslaughter, unlawful act manslaughter in criminal law, exploring the essential elements and legal principles that define this offence. Now, my name is Nasir Hafizi. I'm a solicitor and senior lecturer. Remember the picture in this slide of a man on a ladder. Make sure you don't push the ladder and make that person on the ladder fall, because that would be unlawful act manslaughter, even if it was done as a prank if the person dies. Now, the learning objectives for this class is to look at unlawful act manslaughter. So I want to define and explain the elements of unlawful act manslaughter, including those four requirements: a criminal act, objective dangerousness, causation, and the necessary mens rea. I want to analyse leading cases such as R versus Church, R versus Dawson, R versus Kennedy, and R versus Lamb to understand how courts determine liability. And then we evaluate the distinction between unlawful act manslaughter and gross negligent manslaughter, focusing on the type of conduct, act versus omission, and the role of foreseeability and risk in establishing liability. As always, there are these true or false questions. This one is on unlawful act manslaughter. And as always, there's going to be the answers at the end. So please check your answers with the answers given at the end. So true or false? Question 1. Unlawful act manslaughter is also known as constructive manslaughter. Question 2. True or false? The defendant must commit an unlawful act, and that it is in itself a criminal offence requiring intention or recklessness. Question 3, true or false? Negligent acts such as careless driving can amount to an unlawful act for manslaughter purposes. Question 4, true or false? In R versus Lowe, 1973, it was confirmed that omissions cannot form the basis of unlawful act manslaughter. Question 5, true or false? In R versus Lamb, the defendant was guilty of unlawful act manslaughter because he accidentally shot his friend whilst joking. Question 6, true or false? The act must be objectively dangerous. That is one which all sober and reasonable people would inevitably recognise as exposing another to the risk of some harm. Question 7, true or false? The test of dangerousness from R versus Church focuses on what the defendant personally foresaw at the time of the act. Question 8, true or false? In R versus Dawson, 1985, the defendant's convictions were quashed because the reasonable person at the scene would not have known about the victim's heart condition. Question 9, true or false? The unlawful act must cause the victim's death. If the chain of causation is broken, the defendant cannot be guilty of unlawful act manslaughter. And question 10, supplying drugs that are voluntarily self-administered by the victim will not normally make the supplier guilty of unlawful act manslaughter. Again, in these criminal law classes, there are single best answer questions, and then at the end there are also single best answer question answers with a little explanation. So please watch to the end. So the first question is single best answer question 1. Defendant and his friends are joking around with the victim at a party. To scare him, defendant lightly punches the victim on the arm while shouting, "Don't mess with me." The victim, who has a rare heart condition unknown to D, collapses and dies. Medical evidence shows that the shock from the sudden assault triggered cardiac arrest. Which is the correct legal position? Is it A, defendant is not guilty because he did not foresee any risk of death? Is it B, defendant is guilty because assault is an unlawful act and objectively dangerous even if the defendant did not know of the victim's condition? C, defendant is not guilty because he only intended it as a joke. Is it D, defendant is not guilty because the act was not directed at causing harm? Is it E, D is guilty only of common assault? And then look at single best answer question 2. Defendant prepares a syringe of heroin for the victim, a regular user. Victim voluntarily injects himself and later dies from an overdose. The prosecution alleges unlawful act manslaughter based on unlawful possession and supply of Class A drug. Which is the correct legal position? Is it A, defendant is guilty because the act of supplying drugs caused the death? Is it B, defendant is not guilty because the victim's voluntary injection broke the chain of causation? Is it C, defendant is guilty because he foresaw that the victim might overdose? Is the answer D, defendant is guilty if he injected the victim himself? Or is the answer E, defendant is not guilty only if he was unaware of the risk of overdose? Then look at single best answer question 3. 3 use D1, D2 and D3 break into a shop intending to steal. When the victim, the shopkeeper, confronts them, the defendant 1 waves a metal bar threateningly. Frightened, the victim suffers a fatal heart attack. None of the defendants physically touched the victim. Medical expert confirms that the heart attack was triggered by fear and stress. Which is the correct legal position? Is it A, defendants are guilty because the burglary was an unlawful act that caused death and was objectively dangerous? Is it B, defendants are not guilty because there was no physical violence? Is it C, defendants are not guilty because they did not intend to cause harm? Is the answer D, only D1 is guilty because he had the metal bar? Or is the answer E, defendants are guilty only if they knew of the victim's heart condition? Now, let's go into this offence of unlawful manslaughter. It's also known as unlawful and dangerous act manslaughter or constructive manslaughter. The term constructive reflects how liability for death is constructed from the defendant's commission of a lesser crime. Despite these different names, they all refer to the same criminal offence with identical legal requirements and consequences. There are basically 4 elements to unlawful act manslaughter. The first one is the unlawful act. The defendant must commit a criminal offence requiring intention or recklessness. Secondly, the act must be dangerous. The defendant must carry out a positive dangerous act. The test for dangerousness is objective. Causation is the third element, which is the unlawful act must cause a defendant's death. And then the final element is mens rea. There is no single definition of mens rea for unlawful act manslaughter. It simply needs to match the unlawful act. So all 4 elements must be proven beyond reasonable doubt for a successful prosecution. Now the third element involves a standard causation principles covered elsewhere in our criminal law classes. That's legal causation, factual causation and legal causation. So let's look at each of these elements in turn. So the first one is the unlawful act requirement. The prosecution must prove the defendant committed an unlawful act, specifically a crime requiring mens rea of intention or recklessness. Crimes of negligence, such as careless driving, will not suffice. When the unlawful act is assault, prosecutors typically choose the easiest level to prove, usually battery, also known as physical assault, involving unlawful application of force. There's a case study here of an example of Steve and Tony. Steve is angry at his teenage son for staying out late. They begin arguing and Steve pushes Tony in the chest, causing him to fall backward and strike his head on the concrete floor. Tony dies as a result of a bleed to the brain. Now the unlawful act here is the physical assault, the battery, the application of unlawful force. As this offence may be committed intentionally or recklessly, it qualifies as an unlawful act for involuntary manslaughter purposes. Now, beyond assault, there are other unlawful acts too. Any offence requiring proof of intention or recklessness qualifies. So, in the case of DPP versus Newbury and Jones in 1977, defendants pushed a paving stone over a bridge into a train path, killing the guard through the window. The Court of Appeal confirmed conviction based on criminal damage. The defendants need not intend to or foresee the risk of harming anyone. The focus is simply whether an unlawful act occurred. Now, another example is a burglary example. Steve breaks into his neighbour's property at night. The house is owned by Tony, a frail 75-year-old man with chronic asthma. Tony hears noises, comes out of his bedroom, is confronted by Steve, becomes terrified and suffers a fatal asthma attack. The unlawful act here is burglary. As it causes Tony's death, Steve would likely be convicted of unlawful act manslaughter, demonstrating how various crimes can form the basis of this offence. Remember, there needs to be a positive act requirement for unlawful act manslaughter. So the defendant must commit a positive act. Failure to act cannot give rise to unlawful act manslaughter charges. This was established in the case of R versus Lowe, 1973. In Lowe, the defendant's conviction for unlawful act manslaughter based on child neglect was quashed by the Court of Appeal because no unlawful act had been committed, only an admission. So when no unlawful act exists, so in R versus Lamb, this is 1967, defendant and victim were playing with a revolver. As a practical joke, Unaware, bullets rotated in the chamber. Lamb pointed the gun at his friend and pulled the trigger, shooting him dead. Lamb was found not guilty on appeal because there was no unlawful act of assault. He believed they were playing a game, which itself was not a criminal offence. Now, the second element for unlawful act manslaughter is the dangerous act element. Beyond being unlawful, the act must also be dangerous. So in R versus Bull, 1989, the defendant loaded a shotgun with cartridges from his pocket containing both live and black rounds. He fired at his neighbour without checking the cartridge and killed him. Despite claiming he only intended to frighten the victim with a blank, he was convicted of unlawful act manslaughter based on simple assault. Now, the test for dangerousness. This is objective test. The test for dangerousness is entirely objective. In R versus Church, 1966, the Court of Appeal established that the unlawful act must be one which all sober and reasonable people would inevitably recognise must be subject the other person to at least the risk of some harm, albeit not serious harm. Whether this particular defendant recognised their danger is irrelevant. It's judged from the ordinary reasonable person perspective. Now, when determining whether a reasonable person would recognise risk of harm, they are deemed to have the knowledge the defendant had or should have had at the time of the offence. R versus Dawson, 1985, 3 defendants attempted petrol station robbery with masks, pickaxes, handles and replica guns. The victim, a 60-year-old attendant with heart disease, suffered fatal heart attack after the defendants fled. The appeals was successful, the convictions were quashed. A reasonable person at the scene wouldn't have known of the heart condition. The context of dangerousness is important. Whether an act is objectively dangerous depends on particular facts and knowledge available to the reasonable person. So in R versus Burstow, 2013, defendants burgled a vehicle repair business in a remote rural location. Whilst driving away, they ran over and killed the victim. The burglary was held objectively dangerous because access was via a single lane track. A reasonable person would recognise intervention therefore risks death. So as a summary of dangerousness, the risk of some harm, dangerousness means the act carries a risk of some harm to some person, but not necessarily serious harm. There's no precise foresight required. The defendant need not foresee the precise form or sort of harm that ensues. It's an objective test whether all sober and reasonable people would think the act dangerous, not whether the defendant did. And when it comes to deemed knowledge, a reasonable person has defendant's knowledge or what they should have had watching the whole act. Now let's turn to the third element, causation. This is the final actus reus element, requires that the unlawful act causes the victim's death. Standard causation rules apply. The defendant must be both the factual and legal cause of the victim's death. If prosecution cannot prove causation, the accused won't be liable for murder or manslaughter, though they may be guilty of another criminal offence such as assault. And please watch the classes on factual and legal causation. There are some difficulties when it comes to drugs cases when it comes to causation. Causation has caused particular difficulty in drug offences where defendants supply victims with illegal drugs from which they die. The problem here is if the defendant freely and voluntarily injects themselves, the chain of causation may be broken. The result, the defendant will not be guilty of unlawful act manslaughter despite supplying the fatal drugs. So let's look at the final element of unlawful act manslaughter, the fourth element, the mens rea requirement. The mens rea of unlawful act manslaughter varies depending on the circumstances as it links to the underlying unlawful act. There's no single definition of mens rea for this offence. It simply needs to match the unlawful act committed by the defendant. So as an example, the arson example here, Steve discovers his neighbour Tony is a convicted paedophile. When Tony goes on holiday, Steve sets fire to Tony's empty house to drive him out. Unknown to Steve, Tony has returned home early and dies in the fire. Although Steve thought the house was empty, he remains criminally responsible. The unlawful act here is arson, which is objectively dangerous. Steve has the mens rea for arson, direct intent to destroy property belonging to another. So the key legal principles here are an objective assessment. Dangerousness is judged by the reasonable person standard, not the defence personal view. There's got to be a causation chain, an unbroken causal link required between unlawful act and the victim's death. You've got this flexible mens rea aspect to unlawful act manslaughter. Mental element matches the underlying unlawful act, not a fixed standard. And remember, it's a positive act requirement. Omissions cannot form the basis of unlawful act charges. So going back to these these true and false questions, this one's on unlawful act manslaughter. Feel free to pause this video and check what your answers are with the next slide. This is the next slide. Hope you got the answers right. Now look at the next 3 single best answer questions. This is single best answer questions 1 and 2. Feel free to pause and check what your answer is with the next slide. And here is the next slide, and there's a brief explanation of the answers too. And pay attention to that case of single best answer question 2 and reflect on some of the points that were made in previous slides. Then look at single best answer question 3. This is about dangerousness and causation. Feel free to pause the slide and check the next slide. And here is the next slide. And hopefully got the answer here as well. And this one's about the objective nature of the dangerousness. So in summary, when it comes to unlawful act manslaughter, it represents a crucial intersection between lesser criminal offences and the most serious consequences, i.e. death. Understanding its 4 essential elements of unlawful act manslaughter: an unlawful act, dangerousness, causation, and the mens rea of the unlawful act are fundamental to proving unlawful act manslaughter. Thanks for watching this criminal law class. If you haven't already, please subscribe, like, comment, and please join me in further criminal law classes as well. Thank you.